Hey everyone, it is good to be with you. We're back.
We are.
I know everyone was really clamoring for this, getting back into the Gospel of Mark. People have been just rioting. There's just been just people streaming outside of the building, just waiting to
Yeah, anxious anticipation
ask
here. Yeah.
when it was coming back. If you want to open to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 9, we're going to be looking there today. If you haven't been part of one of these studies before, we did the first 8 chapters of the Gospel of Mark over a few months, and we're going to finish up the Gospel of Mark over the next few months. So you're welcome to go back and binge watch those if you'd like. They're very binge worthy, but you also could just start with us now and join in. We have really enjoyed going through the Gospel of Mark together. I hope that you have enjoyed it as well. I'm here, as always, with my good friend, Dr. Justin Smith.
Pleasure to be here.
Who is super helpful in diving into this material, and so I'm excited to continue that discussion today. I want to see how have your last few months been, Justin, since we've taken our break?
Sort of simultaneously busy and not busy. So we were without daycare for about 6 weeks. So Teddy and I spent from about 7 until 4 together, 5 days a week.
And how old is he?
He is 19 months. He'll be 20 months here in a week or two. Okay. So a very active, inquisitive 19-month-old.
Bowling ball.
He is, yeah. He gets around really, really well and gets into everything and doesn't slow down much. So I have to admit, it was sort of an interesting moment. About 3 or 4 weeks into that, I was starting to get stressed because, I wasn't able to do some of the work that I wanted to do to get ready for the fall. And then it just sort of dawned on me, I'm never going to get these moments back. I'm not going to get this time back.
Yeah.
So to be able to have the time to spend with him, I thought was really great. And I made this comment to a colleague recently. I don't know that there's very many people on their deathbeds that say, I really wish I could have worked more.
Definitely.
I should have done 42 hours instead of 40 or 50 instead of 40. I think most of us on our deathbeds will look back and go, I wish, I spent more time with family and friends. So
yeah.
So it's been good. He's fun. So challenging and tiresome, but he's good.
No, I think it's hopefully this time is a clarifying time for all of us about what's truly most important. And I think as far as eventually getting back to some sense of normalcy, I hope we really get to a why question. Like why were we running around like chickens with our head cut off all the time? Like how could we center ourselves on the things that are truly most important that matter so much?
Yeah, and I'm wondering a little bit if that won't be one of the sort of blessings in disguise, or one of the good outcomes of this time is really this reorienting ourselves away from a lot of the busyness as we start to realize 6 months, 7 months, 8 months on that we've made ourselves busy with lots of things that aren't really that important. And maybe in this time we started to reevaluate. I mean, I think in this rush back to normalcy, whatever we think that is, I hope that we're not in such a big hurry to get back to normal that we lose maybe some of the things that we've gained in this time.
Yeah, we just recently, Carter is doing, he's 6 years old, he's doing first grade online, and so we have recess and lunchtime at home.
Yeah.
So we put up a basketball hoop in our front yard, so got to play horse with him for the first time last night on the hoop. Of course I won.
I was going to ask you.
I feel like I got a little bit of a hard time for winning, but it's a little, in my opinion, like a dog marking its territory. I mean, it's kind of just like, you want to kind of say this, I'm not going to beat you every time, but I'm kind of saying this is...
Well, don't feel bad because, Teddy's 19 months and he has a little basketball at the house, and he'll try to sometimes like throw the basketball over one of the gates. I'll just swat that stuff. Like, get that weak sauce out of here. And I'm trying to teach him early that you gotta work for it.
We don't want to soften him up. That's
you gotta work for it.
So we are looking at the transfiguration to begin, trying to get our minds back to Jesus after that commentary. And starting in verse 2 of chapter 9, I'll go ahead and read. this story, which I think is a really important story in the Gospel of Mark. 6 days later, Jesus took Peter, James, and John and led them up a high mountain to be alone. As the men watched, Jesus' appearance was transformed, and his clothes became dazzling white, far whiter than any earthly bleach could ever make them. Then Elijah and Moses appeared and began talking with Jesus. Peter exclaimed, "Rabbi, it's a wonderful thing for us to be here. Let's make 3 shelters as memorials, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He said this because he didn't really know what else to say, for they were all terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my dearly loved son. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, Moses and Elijah were gone, and they saw only Jesus with them. As they went back down the mountain, he told them not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So they kept it to themselves, but they often asked each other what he meant by rising from the dead. Then they asked him, "Why do the teachers of the religious law insist that Elijah must return before the Messiah comes?" Jesus responded, "Elijah is indeed coming first to get everything ready. Yet, why do the scriptures say that the Son of Man must suffer greatly and be treated with utter contempt? But I tell you, Elijah has already come, and they chose to abuse him, just as the scriptures predicted." It was a very interesting scene. Jesus is transfigured and transformed before them. What are some reflections that you have on this?
Well, I always sort of find this moment, I've always found the transfiguration to be really puzzling, to be honest. And it probably really wasn't until maybe even a couple of years ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, that it started to crystallize for me a little bit. I always found this to be a fascinating moment in Jesus' ministry, in Jesus' life, and I don't know, I just, for some reason I thought, why? What is this all about? What is the point here? And I think one of the things that finally sort of occurred to me is, and I think you and I have talked about this, and we've probably talked about this in this discussion on Mark, that we have this really wonderful understanding of who Jesus is with almost 2,000 years of hindsight, right? So as readers of the text who already know who Jesus is as we're coming to this text from a faith perspective, we find all of these really important but wonderful signpost moments in Jesus' life where his identity is being clarified or declared or appropriated or reappropriated or explained. I think we read those moments and we go, well, yeah, of course. Not maybe fully grasping how difficult it probably was for early Christians to wrap their minds around who Jesus was, let alone Jesus' disciples and others. And the thing that's really interesting about the Transfiguration is that it's come right off the back of Peter's confession in chapter 8, where Jesus asks Peter in verse 27 and following, "Who do people say that I am?" Or he asked the disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered, "John the Baptist, others Elijah, and others one of the prophets." So then he says, "Well, who do you say that I am?" And Peter said, "You are the Messiah." And we again sort of have to ask this question, well, when Peter says Messiah, what does he mean? And when Jesus says Messiah, what does Jesus mean? And they're not always one and the same. Yeah. So it's interesting that there is this confusion still about who Jesus is. And so the Transfiguration is ideally this moment of clarity, and yet even in the narrative itself, we see some, confusion continuing on.
Yeah, oh, definitely. And I think it's also interesting to come off the back of what we talked about is the central message of the Gospel of Mark, which is you have to give your life up, take up your cross. Like this is what this requires. I'm not just calling you to something of comfort. I'm calling you to growth and self-denial and learning to walk with me in these certain kinds of ways. And then right after that, as he is trying over and over again to say, "I'm going to die, guys," and the disciples don't get it, then there's this moment, and the word, the transfigured word, it literally means, it's the Greek word for a butterfly coming out of a cocoon. It's what a metamorphosis. It's like this, what is truly inside is being revealed. And I think that is something that is so important coming right after that, where Jesus is saying, I'm going to die, but that doesn't make me any less glorious. Like, this is who I am on the inside, and I'm going to die, but that doesn't mean that I'm not, like, blessed by God.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I think even that language itself is really important, you know, to sort of imagine Jesus coming out of his cocoon is sort of an interesting moment. To be fully revealed, I think is a really important moment. And again, it sort of draws us into this mountain experience with Moses and God fully revealing himself to Moses, you know, on the mountain, whether it's through the Ten Commandments and sort of that expression, or even Moses, you know, deeply desiring to see God, and God saying, you can't really see me and live, but you can kind of get a glimpse of who I am, and what that ultimately does to Moses and the reaction of the people. And something similar here, you have, you know, the disciples, you know, Peter, James, and John are there, and they get a glimpse of who Jesus is as he's sort of being fully revealed in their midst, and they still, you know, don't quite know what to do with this. So I think this moment that comes almost in the middle of the gospel, not quite the middle, but just about the middle, is again sort of this turning point moment that connects us to the baptism, where we get the divine voice, you know, and the claim of Jesus' divine sonship. And then it also will point us to the foot of the cross, when the Roman soldier will say, you know, surely this man is Son of God. So these really interesting declarative moments that draw us, you know, over and over again into who Jesus is as he's being revealed, maybe first in the baptism, now in the transfiguration, and then once again, you know, at the crucifixion, and then ultimately the empty tomb.
Yeah. I was reading, and I found some notes on parallels to the cross, the kind of interesting juxtaposition of things. The glory revealed on the mountain is a private epiphany, while the suffering of Jesus is a public spectacle. Jesus is surrounded on this mountain, like showing who he really is, by two of the most important people in Jewish history, the prophets of old. And then has two thieves next to him on the cross. On the mountain, Jesus' garments glisten like white. I love the note that Mark gives us, like, better than any bleach could. That's how New Testament interpreters take it. But on the cross, Jesus' garments are taken from him in humiliation. 3 male disciples view this from close range. At the cross, 3 female followers, disciples, and his mom view from afar, a bit of a step back. A divine voice says, "This is my son. Listen to him," in this moment. And then on the cross, the Roman centurion announces it there. And then in both scenes, Elijah is brought up. Elijah is there. And then on the cross, maybe Elijah will come and take him down. So there's these really interesting little parts that help us. Exactly. It's kind of just putting this whole thread together.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. And again, it's sort of this interesting, the way that Elijah sort of serves also is sort of this thread, or this hinge point, not only in the transfiguration, and then I think you're right, you know, bringing it up at the cross, but then also what happens just after the transfiguration and just before. You know, Jesus is understood to be Elijah. Then there's questions once Elijah is there at the transfiguration about Elijah's role and sort of messianic declaration or end times. And I think, again, part of the important part with the transfiguration is to ultimately say, if Jesus asked the question, who do people say that I am? Some say John the Baptist come back to life, some say Elijah, some say one of the prophets. Well, here you have Elijah and Moses, probably the 2 greatest prophets in the history of Israel, standing side by side with Jesus, and who remains? It's Jesus. He's not Elijah, he's not Moses. I've also argued, I mean, there's some really wonderful symbolism here. You have Moses representing the law, perhaps, and Elijah representing the prophets. I mean, the 2 sort of major sections of the Hebrew Bible that are oftentimes referenced, you know, I've come to fulfill the law and the prophets. Is there something symbolically happening here too, where again, Jesus becomes this ultimate fulfillment of the law and the prophets, comes down the mountain, right, and then again starts to talk about his suffering and death. And so I think it's a really, for a narrative that is really not very long,
Yeah.
it is really
Very
sort
rich.
of tightly packed, I think, with a lot of meaning and concepts. And at the same time, again, sort of pushes us back to the beginning of the gospel, while at the same time moving us forward into the end, and then sort of uniting Israel's story to Jesus' story, I think, in a really powerful way
Yeah.
at this moment too.
I think it's interesting too what God says, which very much is similar to what the baptism moment is, but God saying, "This is my son," and listen to him, not just stand here and look at him, adore him, but listen
Yeah.
and follow through.
Yeah.
And I think that's really significant.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just it's not a moment to just sort of be in awe and to gawk. It's this moment to really understand who Jesus is, and if you understand who Jesus is, then there's a life that needs to be lived in recognition of that. And I think the thing that again is so wonderfully interesting about this moment is, in the midst of all of this really powerful stuff happening, we have Peter, who ultimately says something and suggests something that on its face sounds like a good idea.
Peter always is the first one to say something, but yeah.
Yeah, and I don't want to say he's half-cocked here. I think in the moment, Peter's probably trying to figure out what the best course of action is.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we've just seen this really wonderful, amazing thing when sort of God's presence is felt, you know, in earthly spaces. We recognize these spaces as sacred spaces and places of worship. But Peter misses the mark because he says, let's build 3 dwellings or 3 tents, or probably more accurately 3 tabernacles, 3 places of worship, essentially one for Jesus, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. And it's then that we get the voice, right? The divine voice that in some ways is not just a declaration of who Jesus is, but a corrective for Peter.
Yeah.
Like, no. There's really only one voice you need to be hearing, one voice you need to be paying attention to, and it's the voice of my beloved son.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that Peter is in my mind so representative of how I believe we can often act when it comes to faith. We have this powerful moment with God, and if you haven't, I would invite you to seek God with your life, because I think that there are going to be moments that you have powerful experiences in worship, and the impulse is then, all right, I want to control God. I want to like put a building around this and like make it permanent, and basically in the kind of extended far out negative view of it, it's I want to trap God. I want to force God to show up in this way. And what I think is so contrary to that impulse is the Spirit of God does what the Spirit of God does. This transfiguration moment, Peter, James, and John, they were witnesses, but that's it.
Yeah.
You know, they weren't part of it. They didn't make it happen. And I think that oftentimes religion in its worst forms can cause us to worship forms of how we've worshiped in the past and worship those things instead of actually saying, God, I want you to lead this.
Right.
And again, like imagine Peter, James, and John coming up with like their best version. It was like, let's do something really powerful today. It would have paled in comparison to what they experienced. But oftentimes I think that's how we fall short. It's like we just kind of get into these ruts of like, all right, like let's do this, and we don't seek God's power and understand that as we are worshiping, we're worshiping a living God who is then calling us to do stuff. And I think a question that we all need to be asking is, as followers and as hopefully members of churches, is, are we allowing God to lead us and God's Spirit and presence? Because it's so much better if God does, but oftentimes we just want to say, all right, well, let's figure this out. And I love Mark's note that it's like he had no idea what he was talking about because he was terrified. And you're right, then God responds and basically says, no, this isn't just a moment of adoration. I don't want you to turn this into a Hallmark card.
Right.
I don't want this to be like a little nice scene. That's not what this is about. And you wish that you could just stay here in the glorious moment, but that's ultimately not what Jesus is going to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think religion at its core is a way that we organize our experiences with the divine, which I think is incredibly helpful. I mean, I think it's something that we build around as community and unites us. But organizing our experiences with the divine isn't the divine. And so here you have them in this moment, in one of the most sort of unbounded, free, open, powerful, sort of unshackled moments of experience with the divine, whether it's with the divinely transfigured Jesus or the voice of, from this clouded, sort of misty space, again, sort of drawing us back into that Moses experience on the mountain. And, Peter's response is like, let's do something.
Yeah.
And I think the voice's response is, no, let's listen.
Yeah.
Right? Like, let's be here, let's be present. Let's really, absorb all of what is happening. There's a time to do things, and there's definitely moments in the ministry of Jesus where the disciples are called to do things, and they will be, called to do things as Jesus' ministry sort of shifts to them post-death. But, that moment is just be here and listen. Like, be present in this way. And so, yeah, I mean, I think there's probably been times in all of our lives where we've been in a really overwhelming space, and, we're searching for something to say, and so we say something, and it's just not the right thing.
Yeah.
And so that voice from heaven sort of says, yeah, don't speak.
Yeah.
Listen.
Yeah.
If you don't have the right thing to say, that's okay. You don't have to. Just listen and be here.
And it's easy to look down on Peter. Peter is the one who actually does something though often, and that I think is admirable. But like I said, I think we all fall into this trap. Yeah. What do churches do when they are established enough? They build a building. And I'm not saying that every church building that exists is bad at all. I think that they can be helpful, but what ends up being hard is when you start to worship the building or the way you worship and not recognize that this is about God continuing to lead us, and we are not in control of that. Yeah. And I think there's moments when we all just are just like Peter, like, oh, well, we did this last year, let's do this again. Like, and like, God showed up when we did this last time, and it's like, is God still asking you to do that thing, though?
I mean, I think faith is an art, not a science, and we get better at it as we practice it. And I think sometimes our approaches to faith are to sort of see it as a science, something that is verifiable and repeatable. We did this and it worked, and let's keep doing it, and if we do it right every time, it should work every time. We should get the same results every time. Yeah. And there's something about that I think is very comforting as we're sort of exerting our control over the thing. But there's something about it that just sort of kind of doesn't feel very relational, because relationships, I think, as you and I both know, aren't scientific in that way. I mean, it doesn't work that way. It's an art. You have good days and you have bad days. You hit the notes right some days, and then you're flat the other days. But you continue to practice, and you continue to be present and continue to be engaged. And I think that's incredibly important, over and against, getting the same results every time.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that then it's great that Jesus just lets Dad do the talking, basically. I love how it's like, and Jesus was just going back down the mountain. It's like, Peter, I'm not even gonna address this. This is not what I'm about. Then there's this long narrative that comes right after this. A demon-possessed boy. I'm not going to read it all because we don't have time to read all of it, but we want to discuss it for a bit here. And basically, they come off this scene and this really powerful moment, and then it's immediately murky again. There's stuff going on.
Yeah.
A lot of Jesus' ministry seems very chaotic. So this demon-possessed boy, nobody can seem to heal him, including the disciples who Jesus has commissioned to do that kind of work, but they're not able to do it. And then the father has a great line, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief, which I think is a moment of tension that we all experience when we're struggling with faith and walking with God. And then Jesus is able to command the spirit to come out of him, and the disciples are like, hey, what happened back there? And he says, well, you need to pray that kind of spirit out, which is interesting. But you were sharing some things about what you think this story parallels to with the story of Moses.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's sort of interesting that this episode comes as Jesus and Peter, James, and John are coming down the mountain. You know, if you remember, Moses goes up on the mountain, he has this God experience, and then when he comes down, he finds the people lacking faith. You know, here they are worshiping, you know, the golden calf and all, you know, basically, for lack of better words, it's almost like all hell is broken loose in a very short period of time. So here Jesus comes down the mountain after a short period of time, and he finds his disciples, his people, lacking faith. It's this interesting paralleling moment where they've done and seen all of these wonderful, powerful things. I mean, it goes back to so many of the different conversations we've had in Mark's gospel, the quieting of the seas, the miracles of the feeding of the multitudes, them not really understanding what all of that is about. This idea that they seem to understand that Jesus can do some things but not other things. And here you have this group that has been empowered to cast out demons, and they seem to have been able to do that at various points. But they come down here, and there's just sort of these layers of disbelief or lacking in faith, whether it's the disciples who seem to be unable to cast out this demon, to the father who says this line, and I love Jesus's response. So in 22, the father's talking, he says, it is often cast him into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you are able to do anything, have pity on us and help us. And then Jesus' response, I think, is one of my favorites. If you are able, all things can be done for the one who believes. I mean, it's hard for me not to think that Jesus is a little bit offended in this moment. Like, if I'm able, sir, yeah. But it's also, I think, this interesting moment too, where it's the way that there's this synergistic relationship between Jesus's power, but faith and belief. So what seems to be hindering this entire process is a lack of belief or a lack of faith. Again, whether on the part of the disciples or this man. And then again, the Father says this wonderful line, I believe, but help my unbelief. Mm-hmm. And you know, Jesus is able to cast out the demon. And then that line at the end, you know, this kind can only come out through prayer. I don't know, it's sort of a puzzling line, but it makes me wonder if, again, that what Jesus is sort of saying is that this kind of situation takes more investment, more thought, more engagement, that it requires more of us than something formulaic, than saying certain words or sort of doing particular actions that produce repeated results. Yeah. What it takes is a deeper dive. What it takes is a deeper engagement. And maybe in some ways this is a subtle criticism, which is to say, you know, you all have been able to sort of cast out these demons and do so in a way that doesn't require you to be engaged, sort of require you to get your hands dirty, if you will. Yeah. And there's something about this that requires more of us. And that requires, I think, a deeper faith and a deeper belief and a deeper engagement. Yeah. But again, it just sort of draws us back into these really interesting parallels between Jesus' mountain experience and Moses' mountain experience and the lack of the faith of the people and the lack of faith that Jesus encounters, and this sort of lack of faith seems, or belief seems to be also kind of this interesting running theme throughout Mark's gospel, even in the midst of all of these really wonderful, powerful things that Jesus does.
Yeah, and that's definitely a theme there, and I just hadn't thought of that parallel with Moses' experience until we talked about that. And I just think it's so true, because like Jesus leaves for just a few minutes and like all hell breaks loose. It's like what's going on? It's a very chaotic scene. There's a lot going on, and yeah, I think this is very, very interesting line, that the idea that it's about prayer and contemplation and asking God to be part of this, very similar to what we were talking about the building of the tabernacles and how we can sometimes get into that space ourselves. It's really important for us to really be God-led and Spirit-led, and like I think we often view prayer as a last resort,
Right.
as person's on the deathbed, all right, I should pray now. But the ministry of Jesus, it is at the forefront, and for the disciples who see him going off and pray all the time, it's like Jesus is like, come on guys, this is what you're supposed to do. Right. You're supposed to pray. Henry Nouwen has a great comment on this. He said, "We've fallen into the temptation of separating ministry from spirituality, service from prayer. Our demons say we are too busy to pray, we have too many needs to attend to, too many people to respond to, too many wounds to heal. Prayer is a luxury, something to do during a free hour, a day away from work, or on a retreat. Prayer is a way of being empty and useless in the presence of God, and so proclaiming our basic belief that all is grace and nothing is simply the result of hard work." And I just think that's so true, that we have separated at times the doing from the really important soul work that we all need to be doing in all of our lives, so that we are becoming the kind of person that Jesus wants us to be. And that takes being God-led and not focus on the forms, but on the living being that we are worshiping and seeking with our lives. And so I just think that this story, coming right on the heels of the Transfiguration, it fits perfectly, because it's like, no, this is what this looks like. You can just exhaust yourself doing these things, and sometimes you need to be with God and say, you are my true source.
Yeah. Well, and I think that again is sort of like this really wonderful connection back to the Transfiguration. I mean, I think that moment is, in its own way, I think, sort of articulating that, like, be here, be present, be with God. And then it sort of pushes us into this space with this narrative where, to what extent are even the disciples being present in what they're doing?
Yeah.
And to what extent are they engaged in all this other stuff that is really sort of untethering them from that source.
Yeah. I think that's a great line to end on, and one that I think sums up what we've been talking about. Be here, be present, be with God. And that's what these two stories are teaching us, and what I think is important for us all to think about. Let me close us with a word of prayer. God, we come to you as your children. We pray over all our anxieties and our worries and the things that are on our hearts and on our minds. I pray for just a moment that we could breathe and just be with you, that we wouldn't just think about all the things that we have to do, or think about prayer as just a luxury, but as our very source of life, to be the people that you call us to be. Help us not to worship forms, but to worship you and who you are. Help us to learn to be with you in such a way that it causes us to be your people and to do your things in the world. Your son, Jesus, and I pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you to Justin for joining me for this conversation. We are going to be having a prayer call if you would like to spend some time in prayer starting at 8 p.m. If you do not have that link, You can email me, Brian with a Y, at glendale.church. We'd love to have you join us on Zoom for that time of prayer. Hope you have a wonderful evening.